Welcome to Philosophy Slam, the podcast, with myself, Mark Vernon, and Robert Rowland Smith. Hi there, Robert.
Hi there, Mark.
We get together and, on the podcast version, use a random word generator to give us two of these brilliant everyday miracles that we call words that together take us on intellectual, philosophical, very often spiritual journeys. And it's therefore a joy to join you again, Robert, to do this once more.
Indeed. And I have been on the random word generator today, and our trusty internet friend has come up with two words for us today: perfection and funeral, which sounds rather heavy. So these are the two we're gonna get going with. Shall I give a couple of initial reactions to those words?
Please do. They sound very rich words. So go for it.
They sound very rich words. I mean, when I think of the word perfection, I think of a medieval poem called Pearl, which I studied when I was in my first year, probably, or second year, maybe, at Oxford. Of course, in Oxford, when you study English, you go right from, well, the joke was always you'd go from Beowulf to Virginia Woolf, although, in fact, you go from a little bit before to a little bit after. But anyway, you go pretty early. And there's a early medieval, maybe Old English poem called Pearl, which is sort of an allegory of perfection, really, because the pearl is a woman, but also a jewel, and also an angel, and also a child. And the poem is a kind of ode, I suppose, to Pearl, who in Old English or Middle English, I think Old English, is often referred to as Maklos. Maklos, where we get the word immaculate from. So a mak is a stain or a wound or a blemish of some kind. So to be maklos or immaculate is to be perfect. And in a way, it is a study of perfection. And one of the interesting things about the poem is really whether this figure, Pearl, is earthly or divine or something in between, I suppose. So we've got all of that going on through the figure of Pearl. And then we've got the question of the funeral, because I immediately connect the two, because the funeral perhaps can be a transitional moment between life and death, not just the end of life, where in fact the question of human perfection might come up. Are you perfect enough to be admitted to heaven? Are you too stained with sin? Have you been cleaned, purified in order to arrive there? And of course, there are some funeral rites, particularly funeral by fire, which I assume, in fact, this may be just an assumption, you probably know more about it, Mark, which I assume is designed to cleanse the body in some way. So the funeral by fire is also a cleansing or a purification process, partly to prepare the body or the soul, I suppose, to burn away the corporeal self and ready it for entering into the afterlife, the heaven or whatever it might be, in a less corrupted manner. So already I'm connecting perfection and funeral a little bit. So what about you? I'm sure you've got lots to say about this.
Yeah, well, the reference to flames, I think, is a good one. But it also makes me think about how, whilst it might, to the modern mind, sound unappealing that somehow we have to be perfected, I think there's actually a freedom there, because what it feels like perfection has become in the modern world is the requirement to actually be perfect, which is very different from being perfected, because the burden falls on you, the individual. And I just wonder whether some of that perfectionist spirit, now that many people have these tools available online where they can perfect themselves, and certainly in terms of outward appearance, that spirit is actually causing us a lot of problems. Because if your external appearance has to be perfect, then somehow you have to be perfect. And the pressure to actually be perfect is too much. causing all sorts of anxieties and troubles. And much better is the older way, where the whole point was that you weren't perfect, but there was a means of being perfected, which is what the old religious traditions have always offered. Now, of course, there's a dark side to that, because the mention of flames might be to do with the perfecting flames, but might also be to do with the punishing flames, where, as it were, you're deemed beyond perfecting and so go to the other place. But nonetheless, I like this idea, and in fact, the word "perfect" is a medieval word. Means sort of to be made complete, and I think it's one of these medieval Latin words that really takes off as the modern mind is starting to develop, because it's about an uncoupling of other worlds and this world, the separation of spirit and matter. And so it becomes really important that if perfection's not available elsewhere, it might be available in the here and now. And so you get words like perfection start to become important modern words, leading to perfectionism and as we're saying. But this sort of flatland extraction of spirit from matter has all these consequences that maybe in an age where the technology seems to enable you to perfect yourself, at least the image of yourself, we find it doesn't really meet the human soul, and so causes the distress that is common for the generations that live their lives online. And then the funeral element. Well, I used to take funerals, and what it makes me think into relation to what you say, because I used to be a clergyman in the Church of England, is that it was one of the elements that I really liked about being a priest. There were many I didn't, which is why I left. But strangely, there was something wonderful about taking funerals, because you had to hold the funeral, you had to hold this rite of passage so that people could experience. But the rite itself, the ritual, the words, they really did the work for you. And it was wonderful, even in times of distress, to see how undergoing the funeral could bring in something for many people, not always, of course, but for many people, that, as it were, came from another place. The word would be liminal. When we're at these kind of edges, if you have the right rite, RITE, then it can actually put you in contact with something that's more than yourself, that, of course, we experience when someone dies, for all the sadness. So the funeral was a moment where, still, even in the modern flatland of our times, something more might be sensed. And so taking a funeral was a very rewarding experience, in fact.
Mm. I've got in my mind James Joyce's pun in Finnegan's Wake, where he adds an F into the middle of funeral, so it becomes fun for all. Very kind of Joycean bit of play there. Because also funerals are supposed to be fun these days, as well as somber, and they are about celebration as much as sorrow or elegy in some way. And actually, just on that, I've noticed that the words elegy and eulogy get mixed up these days a little bit, because an elegy is something elegiac, a lament really, and a eulogy, because of the prefix, the EU, is a positive form of the logos, positive saying. So eulogy is celebration, elegy is sadness. And I've noticed that people use the word eulogy now in funerals where really they mean elegy. So I think the two have got confused, rather like Joyce's funeral and fun for all. And there seems to be now a bit of a resistance to having a funeral that is solely somber, and that this notion of celebrating the life of X seems to be all the more common. I mean, Mark, if you took funerals, I'm sure you saw in the orders of service, a celebration of the life of so and so, as much as the sad stuff that went with it. So It's interesting that there's a bit of slippage there, I suppose, between the eulogy and the elegy these days, which perhaps speaks to a confusion really as to what really a funeral is or what it's for. What are we here to do? Are we to celebrate? Are we to mourn? Are we to do a bit of both? How do we separate them out? If we celebrate, are we undermining the seriousness or the gravity of the thing?
No, it's
Um,
a brilliant observation. I love that, and you understand why people want to celebrate. You understand why the sense of remembering a person and all they brought, and with the gratitude that the eulogy might represent. But I do think that the elegy speaks more deeply to our humanity. Actually, I would incline in that direction, and I think the reason is that the pressure to sort of squeeze into your allotted time all that you can. Um, I don't know. It feels like that drives so much of our modern lives as well. It's very common, for example, to hear people say that they've accepted their death, and up to that point they're just going to do all they can, and there's a sort of slightly manic feel to that. So you get bucket lists, as if it's turning life into just a kind of exaggerated form of consumerism, as if more somehow brings depth to life. And I feel there's something very mistaken about that. Clearly, there's a sort of question of balance in some measure. You don't want people to live life as they've got no opportunities to see things and enjoy things. I'm not advocating some sort of extreme asceticism here, but it feels to me that what we lose is the way that limits actually might deepen experience, rather than this contrary philosophy, which is that ideally no limits is what brings in more and more experience. I don't know, if you think of music, it's a bit like saying, oh, the 12 notes of the scale, they're a limitation, we should blast that, and then the music will become more wonderful. Well, that was tried with serialization in the middle part of the 20th century, and it turns out the music is more or less unlistenable to. So bring back the 12 notes of the scale. Um, or you might say, the limits of words, the thing that we're so interested in, is a constraint. We should overthrow the need for words, because words always narrow us down to what we're trying to say in the moment. Poetry, with its limited lines and its formulas and so on, is doing the opposite of what it actually does, which of course is it intensifies, it brings focus, it makes the particular into an expression of the universal. It's a bit like the story of the bird, that thinks that air is actually what stops it flying higher and faster, and if only it could fly in an airless place, it would do better. Which of course we immediately see the stupidity of that. Yeah, so once again, these two words taking us into all sorts of directions, that people really wrestle with now.
yeah. I mean, that notion you say there of the bucket list having to have done a certain number of activities or had a certain number of experiences before dying also speaks to this notion of perfect. What's a perfect life? I had a perfect life because I visited all 5 or 7 continents of the earth, or because I did all the things I was supposed to do. I had a complete, happy family and so on. So there is, I think you're right about that. There is the idea of the perfect life, or also like I was thinking the perfect holiday, that notion that the perfect holiday is somehow, in a way, almost too ideal. Like you can't encounter disruption in any way or otherness. Like it just has to play out according to the plan, and then it's perfect. But the other link I wanted to make actually between funeral and perfection was the word mortality. Obviously, a funeral wouldn't happen if we weren't mortal. And it made me wonder if there's something about being mortal and certainly being human, which is about imperfection. We are imperfect. And uh, I mean, when I was studying at A levels and doing English literature for my first degree, there was a lot of emphasis in Renaissance literature that we were encouraged to look at around human perfectibility. This was apparently a Renaissance aspiration or mantra, and we were supposed to think about people like Leonardo and the idea of man is the measure of all things, and whatever mankind is, obviously mankind rather than womankind, he is perfect insofar as he is a kind of microcosm of the divine, or an echo of the ideal divine in some way. And so, in principle, human beings are perfect because they're made in the image of God. So although they're copies, they're not Platonic copies, they are mini copies of God. And in that sense, perfectibility is always possible for us. And yet, we are riven with a fundamental imperfection, which is that we are mortal. I mean, how imperfect can you get? If you're going to die, that's the ultimate fatal flaw. That is imperfection. It's like, I was also thinking there of Henry James's novel, The Golden Bowl, which is really, if I remember it right, a golden bowl is bought as a wedding present for a couple, but the bowl itself has a tiny hairline crack in it. It's imperfect, and that stands as a metaphor and a foreboding and an augury of the marriage. I may be misremembering slightly, but the point, I think, remains that mortality, being human, is a state of imperfection, and the fact we have funerals is a sort of confirmation of that fact, that we are never completely made through. You refer to the Latin etymology. We're not made through from facere, I think, to make things complete or whole. We're not whole. We have this flaw in us. We have this hairline crack, and ultimately we split apart and die in some way. So it's interesting. I mean, there is a fundamental fact there about imperfection and mortality on the one hand, but then an aspiration for perfectibility, which says we can be perfect by embracing the notion that we are, as it were, fractals of the divine in some way.
I mean, speaking sort of quite directly personal, my main spiritual practice, you might say, is a combination of relating to perfection through a practice which is a kind of dying to self. It would be called an apophatic form of contemplation, to use fancy words, but broadly the idea is that it's putting all that you regard yourself to be into what's sometimes called the cloud of forgetting, and then attending in that place of emptiness to the cloud of unknowing. And these two words, cloud of unknowing and cloud of forgetting, come from this medieval text called the Cloud of Unknowing. We don't know the author, but nonetheless the book's called the Cloud of Unknowing. And it, in one way, is about saying that death is not something that brings life to an end, but is part and parcel of everyday life, because the dying to your limited self, at least in principle, and this is easy to say, it's a whole practice, which you constantly fail to achieve, but nonetheless, that very failure is somehow part of the practice too, to attend to that source which is other than yourself, where a kind of completion actually lies. Thinking of perfection in the sense of completion, rather than without flaw. And so the aim is to become familiar with death in the everyday, so that, as it were, the death that brings to a close mortal life is part and parcel of that practice as well. It's just a particularly dramatic moment in the everyday practice. And I think that this is also related to Aristotle's notion that the happy life isn't known until the person is on their deathbed. And it's partly because then you can sort of see what happened in your life in the round. And I think we've said before, happiness and happenstance are really closely related. And so the luck that your life has brought you, which of course was thought to be from the gods as well, is an integral part of how you might assess your life, whether it's more elegiac or worthy of a eulogy. But I think it's also to do with this way that actually, strangely for we human beings in our finitude, letting go of ourselves in order to be more open to the more is actually part of what makes for a good life. So, again, to go back to where we were starting, the big mistake is to think that your life is perfectible, but it's also a mistake to think that your life can't share in a kind of wider perfection, a wider completion. And so giving your life to that wider perfection is the way to go. And there's something about dying to yourself and being open to more, which of course we remember in funerals, that's part of that as well. I hope that sort of that weaves together some of the things we've been linking in these two wonderful words.
It
So maybe
does.
we're
That's beautiful, Mark.
Yeah, well, let's draw to a close there with those thoughts. But Robert, thanks so much once again. And you've been listening to Philosophy Slam, the podcast. And if that intrigued you, interested you, brought you to the edge where you want to know more, then do subscribe. And we will join you again.